I didn't know my life would split into before and after because of one quiet decision made on a Saturday evening in early September. If you had asked me 6 weeks earlier who I trusted most in the world, after my own family, I would have said my fiancé without hesitation. Ethan, the man I had been with for nearly 3 years, the man I had just said yes to, the man I believed I was building a calm, steady future with. I thought engagement meant clarity, alignment, that moment where two lives finally stop drifting and lock into place. Instead, it unlocked something I had never seen before. 10 days after Ethan proposed, I came home from work and found four women I had never met sitting in my living room, drinking from my wine glasses, laughing loudly, treating my home like a lounge they'd always owned. They weren't acquaintances. They weren't coworkers. They were introduced, casually, as his closest friends from college. Friends he had somehow never mentioned in 3 years. I remember standing in the doorway, my bag still on my shoulder, my brain trying to catch up to the scene in front of me. The wine rack, my collection, built slowly over 4 years, already looked lighter. The air felt off, like I had walked into a version of my life that didn't belong to me. That night was only the beginning. Over the next 6 weeks, my home stopped feeling like mine. My boundaries were dismissed. My concerns were reframed as control. My generosity became an expectation, and every time I tried to talk about it, I was told, by Ethan and by people who had appeared out of nowhere, that I was toxic, fragile, afraid of a strong man. Then came the dinner bill. Then came the lies. Then came the moment I watched, through my own doorbell camera, someone walk out of my house carrying something deeply personal to me, while my fiancé told me I was forgetful for questioning it. I didn't recognize the man I was engaged to anymore. And the most terrifying realization wasn't that he had changed. It was that he insisted this was who he had always been. By the time I asked for the ring back, I already knew something darker was hiding underneath the surface, something rehearsed, coordinated, and deliberate. I just didn't yet understand how deep it went. Before everything went wrong, I honestly believed I'd gotten lucky. I'm Sienna, 30, and I work in marketing for a pharmaceutical company. The kind of job that looks polished on LinkedIn but feels like constant pressure in real life. Deadlines, launches, campaigns that have to be perfect because one mistake becomes a ripple in a system bigger than you. I've always been the type to keep my head down, do the work, and let my results speak. Maybe that's why I fell for Ethan. He was 32, a project manager at a construction firm, and he carried himself like someone who could handle chaos without letting it touch him. Calm voice, practical plans, the kind of man who could look at a complicated situation and break it into steps. We met at a charity event through a mutual friend, Dorothy, and it didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like relief. We stood near the silent auction table, making small talk about the overpriced gift baskets, and Ethan leaned in with a half smile and said, "This is the only place where bidding on a weekend getaway feels like paying taxes." I laughed, real laughter, not the polite kind, and something in my shoulders unclenched. Our relationship built slowly. Dinners that turned into long walks, weekend mornings that didn't feel rushed, the kind of quiet affection that made me feel safe enough to exhale. Ethan didn't play games. He wasn't overly jealous. He didn't make grand speeches. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered the small things, my preference for oat milk, the fact that I hated surprise phone calls, the way I got overstimulated at loud parties. And I liked that he wasn't flashy. By the time we hit our first year together, we were talking about the future in calm, measured sentences. Kids, eventually. A wedding that felt like us, not a performance. Finances that made sense. A home that didn't feel like either of us had to shrink. When we decided to move in together after about 18 months, it felt like the next natural step, not a leap. We both had our own apartments before that. We picked his place because it was closer to my office and had better light, and we agreed on something simple: split rent and utilities down the middle. No power games, no secret resentment. Living together was easy. We cooked most nights. We traded chores without drama. Ethan would wash dishes while I packed lunches for the next day. On weekends, we'd go for coffee, walk through farmers markets, come home, and spend the afternoon in comfortable silence. Him reading, me catching up on work, or watching something mindless. His parents lived out of state. Mine were about 2 hours away. That meant we weren't constantly pulled into family obligations. We had space to be us. If there were signs, I didn't see them. Ethan wasn't secretive with his phone. He didn't disappear for long stretches. He didn't have weird excuses. He didn't even seem like someone who needed a crowd around him. If anything, I worried he might be too quiet sometimes, too internal, but it never felt like deception. It felt like personality. Then, in early September, on a Saturday evening, he took me to the botanical gardens, the place where we'd had our third date. I still remember the way the air smelled: damp soil, roses, the faint sting of late summer heat trying to hang on. He stopped near the rose section, took my hand, and his thumb brushed my knuckles like he was grounding himself. "Sienna," he said, voice steady, "I don't want to build a life with anyone else." And then he got down on one knee. My brain went blank in that stunned, bright way, like a camera flash behind your eyes. I heard myself say yes before my thoughts caught up. I cried, I laughed, I kissed him, and for the rest of the night we called our families and the few people who mattered. His mom sounded tearful and proud. My parents were thrilled. Dorothy squealed like it was her own engagement. And for the first few days after, nothing felt strange. I looked at venues online. Ethan talked about summer dates, outdoor spaces, easy guest lists. We drove to celebrate with my parents that weekend. My dad grilling, my mom pulling out old wedding photos, all of us smiling like we were finally stepping into something good. That's what makes the shift so hard to explain. Because 10 days after Ethan proposed, it felt like someone else walked into my life wearing his face. The first crack didn't come with a fight. It came with laughter that didn't include me. 10 days after the engagement, I got home from work on a Wednesday evening, mentally exhausted and already picturing a quiet night, leftovers, a shower, maybe an episode of something forgettable. When I unlocked the door, the sound hit me before the sight. Voices, loud, overlapping. I stepped inside and froze. 4 women I had never seen before were sprawled across my living room, legs tucked under them on the couch, shoes kicked off near the coffee table. My wine glasses were in their hands. My wine bottles, some of them, were empty on the counter. Ethan sat among them, leaning back, laughing like this was the most natural thing in the world. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd walked into the wrong apartment. Then Ethan looked up, saw me, and waved. "Hey, babe." No warning, no text, no heads up. He introduced them casually, like I was the outsider. Cynthia, Jessica, Brittany, and Lauren. His closest friends from college, he said. His inner circle. I remember shaking hands, forcing a polite smile, waiting for someone, anyone, to explain why this was happening now. They barely looked at me. Cynthia glanced at the wine rack and asked, "Do you have more of that red? This one's gone." I went to the kitchen and grabbed another bottle, my movements slow and deliberate. When I came back, Jessica held out her empty glass without a word, already turned away from me. I poured. Ethan didn't say thank you. He didn't explain. He didn't notice the tension blooming behind my ribs. I retreated to the bedroom to change, hoping maybe this was temporary, some strange, one-off moment I just hadn't been looped into. But when I came back out, they were still there, louder now, comfortable. I made myself a sandwich and ate standing at the counter like a guest in my own home. They didn't leave until nearly 11. When the door finally closed behind them, I asked Ethan, carefully, why he hadn't told me people were coming over. He shrugged. It was spontaneous. Don't make it a thing. Then he added, "You seemed kind of unfriendly. You could have hung out instead of hiding in the kitchen." That was the first time I felt something twist. 3 days later, they came back. This time on a Saturday afternoon. This time with 2 more women, Danielle and Margaret. 6 total. Ethan introduced them like it was obvious they belonged there. He called them his core group. I asked, trying to keep my voice level, why I had never heard about them in 3 years. He smiled like I was missing something simple. I keep different parts of my life separate until I'm ready to blend them. That day they drank 5 bottles of wine. Some of them weren't cheap. A few were gifts. One was from a trip Ethan and I had taken together the year before. I watched the labels disappear, one by one, like I was watching something personal dissolve. I waited until they left. Then I told Ethan we needed to talk about boundaries. He laughed, said I was being uptight, said engaged couples shouldn't be weird about each other's friends, said I was acting like a stranger in my own relationship. The next week, things escalated quietly. Ethan started going out with them almost every other night. He came home late. Sometimes he smelled like cigarettes, even though he'd quit years ago. When I asked, he brushed it off. "Someone else smokes. I can't control people." His tone shifted. He started calling me babe in a way that felt sarcastic. He stopped asking about my day. Conversations turned shallow, transactional, like he was performing a role. 2 weeks after meeting them, he suggested we all go out to dinner together. A restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try. I agreed, telling myself that maybe, if I understood them better, this tension would ease. I didn't realize I was walking into something designed to measure me, to push me, to see how far I'd bend. The dinner happened on a Friday night. By the time I arrived, my chest already felt tight, like my body knew something my mind was still trying to rationalize. The restaurant was warm, dimly lit, the kind of place that hummed with low conversation and clinking glasses. 8 of us sat at a long table near the back, Ethan at one end, me at the other, and his 6 friends filling the space between us like a physical barrier. That alone should have told me something. They ordered immediately. Cocktails, appetizers, more cocktails. No one asked if I wanted anything beyond a quick, "You good," tossed in my direction. Their conversation stayed inward, looping around shared jokes and references I didn't understand. Every now and then, one of them would turn to me. "So what do you do again? Where are you from?" Short questions, shorter answers when I tried to return them. Ethan barely looked my way. At one point, Jessica laughed and said loudly, "Honestly, Ethan's too good for most women." Everyone laughed. I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I stayed quiet. I told myself this wasn't worth reacting to, that reacting would make me look defensive. The drinks kept coming. I noticed the server hesitate before refilling glasses, glance at the growing pile of empty ones. I knew the bill was climbing fast. I also knew no one had mentioned how it would be split. When the check finally arrived, the server placed it in the center of the table. Ethan reached out, took it, and slid it, smoothly, confidently, directly in front of me. No explanation, no question, just expectation. I stared down at the number, over 600 on. For a second, everything went quiet in my head. Not anger, clarity, the kind that lands heavy and undeniable. I reached into my wallet and pulled out cash, enough to cover my meal and my drinks. I placed it neatly on the table. Then I stood up. "I'll see you at home," I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. Ethan looked up, startled. "What?" "I'm not paying for 8 people without being asked." And then I walked out. The cold air outside hit my face like a slap. My phone started buzzing before I even reached my car. I didn't answer. By the time I got home, I had 7 missed calls from Ethan and 3 messages from unknown numbers. The texts were sharp, accusatory. "Selfish, you embarrassed him, you made it weird." Ethan didn't come home that night. At 2:00 a.m. a text came through. "I'm staying at Cynthia's, I can't deal with you right now." The next morning, he came back briefly, just long enough to grab clothes. He looked at me like I'd betrayed him. "You humiliated me," he said. "My friends think you're controlling." I told him I wasn't going to be voluntold into paying for an entire table. "That's what partners do," he snapped. "You're making everything difficult." Then he left again. For 3 nights. During that time, the messages kept coming from his friends. They didn't know me. They didn't ask questions. They told me who I was. Fragile. Threatened by strong people. Not woman enough to support a man in. I didn't respond. When Ethan finally came home, he acted like nothing had happened. No apology, no discussion. He just started talking about wedding venues again. Summer dates, outdoor spaces, as if the past week hadn't cracked something open between us. I tried to pretend we were normal. For 2 weeks I tried. But his friends kept showing up unannounced, late at night, staying past midnight, helping themselves to more wine. One night I mentioned, carefully, that it was adding up. Lauren overheard, called me cheap. Ethan told me to drop it. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, everything tipped. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a doorbell camera alert. On my screen, I watched Ethan and Brittany walk out of our front door, carrying my golf clubs. The ones my father had given me when I graduated. I called Ethan immediately. "Why are you taking my clubs?" He sounded annoyed. "Brittany's boyfriend wants to try golfing. You said it was fine." "I never said that." He sighed. "You must have forgotten. You've been kind of forgetful lately." Something cold slid down my spine. "If those clubs aren't back in an hour," I said, "I'm reporting them stolen." He laughed. "You're being dramatic." 50 minutes later, another alert. Brittany returned alone, dropped the clubs on the step, looked straight into the camera, and flipped it off. One club had a fresh scuff. Ethan texted later that night. "Calm down. I was just helping someone out." That was the moment I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, and admitted the truth to myself. I didn't recognize the man I was engaged to, and I was done pretending that was normal. That night, I didn't cry. I sat on the couch long after midnight, the apartment dark except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside. The golf clubs leaned against the wall near the door, one of them scarred now, small, but unmistakable. I kept staring at that mark, like it was proof of something my mind was still trying to process. Not the damage. The disrespect. I replayed everything in order, forcing myself not to skip ahead or soften it. The sudden appearance of the friends, the wine, the dinner bill, the way Ethan spoke to me, as if I was confused, emotional, exaggerating. The way he told me I was forgetful when I knew, with absolute clarity, that I hadn't agreed to any of it. That tactic hit me hardest. Because it wasn't anger. It was gaslighting. When Ethan came home after midnight, I was still awake. He looked surprised to see me sitting there, annoyed even. "We need to talk," I said. He rolled his eyes. "I'm exhausted. Can this wait?" "No." He dropped his keys on the counter harder than necessary and crossed his arms. "Fine." I asked him directly why he had changed so much in the past 6 weeks. He didn't hesitate. "I haven't changed." My chest tightened. "Then why does everything feel different?" He shrugged. "This is who I've always been. You just weren't paying attention." That sentence landed like a slap. I asked him why he had never mentioned these friends in 3 years. "I told you," he said sharply. "I keep my worlds separate." "And when do I get to be part of your world?" I asked. He didn't answer that. Instead, he accused me of being threatened by his independence, of trying to control who he spent time with, of making him choose. I told him, slowly, carefully, that if this was who he really was, then I had made a mistake proposing. That got his attention. His face changed. The confidence drained out of it, replaced by something tight and watchful. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying I don't know if I want to marry someone who lies to me, dismisses me, and lets other people disrespect me in my own home." Silence stretched between us. I told him I wanted the engagement ring back, that we needed to pause everything and figure out what was happening before it went any further. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he took the ring off his finger and placed it on the kitchen counter. Slow, deliberate, not thrown, not slammed. Just left. Without another word, he went into the bedroom, packed a bag, and walked out. The next day, the messages started again. His friends told me I was insecure, that I couldn't handle a man with a life, that I would regret this. Ethan sent a long message saying he had only wanted to share his world with me, and that I was ruining everything by being rigid. I didn't respond. Instead, I called a locksmith. Then I called my brother. I told him everything, every detail I had been holding back. He listened quietly and finally said, "It sounds like he was pretending to be someone else for 3 years. You're lucky you found out now." That thought sat heavy, but it rang true. 3 days later, Ethan came by to get more of his things. He asked if we could talk. I said yes, but not alone. I called Dorothy, the friend who had introduced us. I also called Gary and Tom, 2 people I'd known since high school, men who knew me well enough to tell when I was being manipulated. When everyone arrived that evening, Ethan looked startled. "Why are all these people here?" he asked. "I want witnesses," I said calmly. "I don't trust your version of events anymore." Dorothy asked what was going on, and I laid it all out, chronologically, clearly. The friends, the wine, the dinner, the clubs. Ethan tried to interrupt, said I was exaggerating, that his friends were just trying to get to know me. Tom asked him directly why he had taken my clubs without asking. Ethan said he thought I had agreed. Gary shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." Dorothy spoke up then, quiet, firm. "I've known Ethan for years," she said, "and I've never heard him mention any of these friends." Ethan got defensive, said he didn't owe anyone explanations. That's when I told him how much the wine alone had cost me. I told him the dinner bill wasn't acceptable. I told him taking my property and lying about it wasn't acceptable. And I told him, plainly, that if he couldn't explain why he had become someone I didn't recognize after our engagement, then there was no future to discuss. He stood up, picked up the ring, held it out to me. "You clearly don't appreciate what you had," he said. "You'll never find someone as good as me." Then he walked out. When the door closed, no one spoke for a long time. Gary finally exhaled. "I can't believe what I just saw." Tom nodded. "It's like he was replaced." 3 weeks passed. Ethan moved the rest of his things out while I was at work. He sent one final message. "You've made a huge mistake." I blocked his number. I didn't have answers yet. But for the first time since the engagement, I felt like I could breathe. I thought the worst was over once Ethan moved out. I was wrong. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the quiet before something else surfaced. About 4 days after the breakup, Dorothy called me. Her voice sounded hesitant, like she'd been turning something over in her head for days and finally couldn't hold it anymore. "Sienna," she said, "I know this might sound strange, but something about Ethan doesn't add up." I invited her over that evening. She arrived with her laptop tucked under her arm, eyes focused in a way I recognized. Dorothy wasn't dramatic. She didn't jump to conclusions. If she said something felt off, it meant she had evidence, or was close to finding it. "I couldn't reconcile the Ethan I knew for years with the man I saw that night," she said once we sat down. So I started digging. She told me she had looked for Cynthia, Jessica, Brittany, Lauren, Danielle, and Margaret online. The profiles she found were thin, minimal photos, limited histories, and none of them had a single picture with Ethan from before the engagement. That alone raised questions. Then she did something more thorough. She went back through Ethan's social media, years of posts, tags, comments. "There's nothing," she said quietly. "Not one mention, not one photo, not one interaction." My stomach sank. "For people who were supposedly his closest friends from college," Dorothy continued, "that's not normal." Then she opened another tab. This time it was Cynthia's profile. About 3 months before Ethan proposed to me, Cynthia had made a public post announcing the launch of something called Sovereign Brothers. The words jumped off the screen. "A community for men to reclaim power in relationships. Stop settling. Make her prove her worth. Test boundaries before commitment." The comments underneath were worse. "Jessica, don't let her get comfortable." Brittany, "If she resists, she's not wife material." Lauren, "Make her show who she really is." I felt cold. Dorothy leaned back. "This looks like a script." I didn't want to believe it. The idea that my engagement had triggered some kind of coordinated testing felt unreal, too calculated, too cruel. But then Dorothy told me something else. She had reached out to Beth, a woman Ethan had mentioned early in our relationship as a college friend he'd lost touch with. Beth still lived in the same city where Ethan went to school. Beth had never heard of any of those 6 people. And according to her, Ethan hadn't had a large friend group in college at all. He'd been quiet, reserved, focused on work. That night, after Dorothy left, I sat with that information for hours. The pieces started clicking together in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. The sudden personality shift, the synchronized behavior, the identical language they used when they spoke to me, the constant pressure, the insistence that my boundaries were flaws. 2 days later, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Check your email." The message in my inbox had no subject line. It was long, carefully written. It was from Danielle. She said she felt guilty, that she couldn't sleep, that she needed to explain what had happened. Danielle wrote that Ethan had joined Sovereign Brothers about 4 months before the proposal. The group was run by Cynthia and framed itself as male empowerment, teaching men how to avoid being controlled after commitment. According to her, the group encouraged men to test their partners after engagement, bring friends around without warning, expect financial generosity without discussion, create small conflicts to see how much resistance there is, borrow or take personal items to see what matters more, possessions or loyalty. The goal, she wrote, was simple. Either the woman submits, or she leaves, proving she wasn't worthy of marriage. Danielle admitted the golf club incident had been her idea, suggested by Cynthia to see if I would explode or fall in line. She said Ethan had been praised in the group for how he handled me, how calm he stayed while I overreacted. I read the email 3 times. It explained everything. The language, the timing, the coordination, the way Ethan seemed to be following invisible instructions. I forwarded the email to Dorothy. She called me within the hour. "I was afraid of this," she said. "These groups are popping up everywhere. They sell fear as empowerment." 2 days later, Ethan called me. I almost didn't answer. But something in me needed to hear it. He asked if we could meet, to talk, to explain. We chose a coffee shop near my office, neutral, public. He was already there when I arrived. He looked different, tired, stripped down, no performative confidence. He admitted he'd joined Sovereign Brothers, said Cynthia had convinced him women always change after marriage. That kindness was a tactic, that I would eventually control him if he didn't assert dominance early. I asked him one question. "Did I ever give you a reason to believe I would hurt you?" He shook his head. "That was the problem," he said quietly. "They said the perfect ones are the most dangerous." He told me he'd left the group after Danielle quit and after I asked for the ring back. Said he realized he'd destroyed everything. Said he wanted to start over. He pulled the ring out of his pocket. I didn't take it. I told him that even if he'd been manipulated, he still chose to hurt me, to lie, to test me instead of trusting me, and that the man I agreed to marry would never have done that, no matter what a group told him. I stood up, left him there, and for the first time I understood. This wasn't about one relationship. It was about power, fear, and how easily love can be turned into a game. Do you want to continue to part 7, Dark Moment? After I left the coffee shop, I didn't feel strong. I felt empty. The adrenaline that had carried me through confrontation drained all at once, leaving behind a heaviness that pressed down on my chest in waves. I walked the 3 blocks back to my office on autopilot, heels clicking against the pavement, my mind replaying Ethan's words over and over like a cruel echo. They said the perfect ones are the most dangerous. That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep, twisting into something painful and personal. Because for the first time, I wasn't just questioning Ethan. I was questioning myself. That night, I went home and sat on the floor of my bedroom, my back against the bed, my knees pulled to my chest. The apartment felt too quiet without his presence, without the version of him I thought I knew. I kept expecting to hear his keys at the door, his footsteps in the hallway, some sign that this had all been a misunderstanding that would resolve if I waited long enough. It didn't. Instead, my phone buzzed with notifications, not from Ethan, but from strangers. People from the Facebook group Dorothy had told me about, men and women who had found my story through shared posts, people whose partners had joined similar groups, different names, same tactics. One message said, "My wife joined something like this after we got engaged. She tested me until I broke. I'm still trying to understand what happened." Another, they called it coaching. It felt like being slowly erased. I read until my eyes burned, and then I broke. Not dramatically, not loudly. I cried the way people cry when they're trying not to wake someone else. Quiet, shaking, almost apologetic. My chest ached from holding so much in for so long. I cried for the future I thought I was stepping into. I cried for the version of myself who had trusted someone completely. And I cried because part of me still wanted to believe Ethan's apology, still wanted to rewind time to the botanical garden before everything splintered. But grief has a way of sharpening truth. And the truth was this. Even if Ethan had been manipulated, I had been sacrificed. Used as proof, as a data point, as something to be tested and discarded if I didn't behave correctly. The lowest moment came 2 nights later. I woke up at 3:17 a.m., heart racing, convinced for a split second that I was late for something important, like I'd forgotten a deadline that would ruin everything. It took a few seconds to remember there was nothing left to fix. No wedding, no shared future. No apology that could undo what had already been done. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling unbearably alone, wondering how close I'd come to marrying someone who believed love needed to be proven through pain. I imagined myself years down the line, questioning every reaction, walking on eggshells, constantly wondering if I was failing some invisible test. The thought made my stomach twist. That was when something inside me shifted, not into anger, but into resolve. I reached for my phone and opened my notes app. I started writing, not to vent, but to document. Dates, conversations, exact phrases Ethan and his friends had used, screenshots, emails. If this wasn't just my story, if this was part of a larger pattern, then it needed to be understood. By morning, I was exhausted but clear-headed. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the city wake up. People walked dogs. Someone laughed on the sidewalk below. Life apparently went on. And I realized something quiet but important. I had survived the worst part, the betrayal, the confusion, the moment where love turns into something unrecognizable. I didn't feel healed, but I felt awake. I felt aware. And I knew that whatever came next, whatever truth surfaced, whatever consequences followed, I wasn't going to carry this alone anymore. Because the darkness had already done its worst, and I was still standing. The turning point didn't arrive with a confrontation. It arrived with confirmation. About a week after the coffee shop meeting, Dorothy called me again, this time with a steadiness in her voice that told me she wasn't speculating anymore. "Sienna," she said, "there's more. And it's not just Ethan." She explained that someone had reached out to her privately through the online group, Brenda, a woman engaged to Cynthia's brother, Eric. Brenda had heard about my situation through family conversations and wanted to talk. When Brenda called me that evening, she didn't waste time. She told me she'd attended 2 Sovereign Brothers meetings, accompanying Cynthia's brother once, out of curiosity. She said the advice disturbed her almost immediately. Not encouragement, not growth, control. She said Cynthia charged monthly fees, hundreds of dollars, additional money for private coaching sessions, where she gave men specific instructions on how to push their partners until they either complied or left. Brenda said Cynthia had been using my story as a success example. She told people Ethan dodged a controlling woman, Brenda said. She said you were proof the system worked. I closed my eyes. Brenda told me Eric had started digging after noticing inconsistencies, bank records, payments, chat logs. He'd found messages where Cynthia coached men to provoke emotional responses, to reframe resistance as toxicity, to turn reasonable boundaries into character flaws. Eric was gathering documentation, and he wanted statements from people who had been affected. That night, I sat at my dining table and finished the timeline I'd started days earlier. I included everything, every date, every incident, every message. I attached screenshots. I sent it to Eric. He replied within hours. Thank you, this matters more than you know. 2 days later, something else happened. Ethan emailed me. Not a plea, not an apology. A confession. He admitted he'd paid Cynthia over $2,000 for coaching sessions. He admitted he'd been told exactly how to act after proposing. He admitted he'd been praised every time I showed discomfort. He said reading the group's internal chats, after leaving, had made him sick. He didn't ask me to come back. He said he needed me to know the truth. I didn't reply, because I finally understood something important. Whether Ethan had been manipulated or not, I had been right to walk away. A few weeks later, Eric followed through. He filed complaints with the IRS and the State Consumer Protection Agency. He submitted evidence showing Cynthia was running an unregistered business, misrepresenting services, and encouraging financial exploitation. He also contacted the platform where Sovereign Brothers operated. Within 2 weeks, the group's page was shut down. Members lost access. Payments stopped. Cynthia tried to migrate to another platform, but without the built-in audience, most people didn't follow. Then a local journalist picked up the story. The article didn't name Cynthia directly, but it outlined the tactics these groups used, quoting people who had lived through it. I was one of them. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of messages poured in, people recognizing patterns, seeing their own stories reflected back at them for the first time. And then, Ethan disappeared from the narrative entirely. Not because he was forgiven, but because he no longer mattered. The power had shifted, not through revenge, not through humiliation, but through truth. Weeks later, Ethan emailed once more. He told me he'd sold the ring and returned the money to his parents, ashamed of how he'd proposed under false pretenses. He said he was moving back to his hometown to start therapy. I wished him clarity. Nothing more, because my life was no longer defined by what I'd escaped. It was defined by what I'd refused to become. The fallout didn't explode all at once. It unfolded slowly, inevitably, like truth always does when there's nowhere left to hide. Once the article went live, the private Facebook group Eric had created grew almost overnight. What had started with a handful of people turned into dozens, then hundreds. Men who had lost marriages, women who had left groups midway and were trying to undo the damage. People comparing notes and realizing, often with shock, that the language used on them was identical. Scripted, recycled. Cynthia's influence collapsed in real time. The platform that shut down Sovereign Brothers sent out violation notices. Payment processors froze accounts pending review. Several former members shared screenshots showing they'd been charged for coaching that never happened, or pressured to upgrade sessions to prove commitment. Eric moved forward with everything. He filed documentation with the IRS regarding unreported income. He submitted evidence to consumer protection agencies about fraudulent practices. He even shared chat logs where Cynthia explicitly instructed men to provoke arguments and then label emotional responses as instability. The consequences were swift. Cynthia's reputation fractured inside her own family first. Brenda told me that when Eric confronted his sister with the evidence, Cynthia accused him of betrayal. She said he was choosing women over family. She threatened to cut him off entirely if he went public. Eric didn't back down. Their relationship ended that day. Within weeks, Cynthia's social circle thinned. Friends distanced themselves. Former members stopped defending her once they realized she'd been making money off their pain. And then the platform bans rolled out. Everywhere she tried to reappear, people followed with warnings. Quiet ones, factual ones, no insults, no drama. Just receipts. As for Ethan, the consequences landed differently. He didn't lose friends in a blaze of scandal. He lost them in silence. People stopped calling. Invitations dried up. The group that had reinforced him vanished, and without it, he had nothing to prop himself up with. Dorothy told me she ran into him once, months later, at a grocery store near his parents' place. She said he looked smaller somehow, quieter. He asked about me. She told him I was doing well. That was all. Meanwhile, my own life started to feel lighter. I sold the ring, not out of bitterness, but closure. I used part of the money to replace the bottles of wine that had been taken. The rest went into savings. Every purchase felt intentional again. I changed the locks, rearranged the furniture, gave away the throw pillows we'd picked together. Small things, but powerful ones. I started saying no faster, without explaining, without apologizing. I went back to routines that belonged solely to me. Early morning walks, yoga classes I'd stopped attending, dinners with friends I hadn't seen in months because I'd been too busy. I noticed how different peace felt when it wasn't conditional. Then, one afternoon, an email arrived. It was from Ethan. One sentence. "I'm sorry I turned love into a test." I read it once. I didn't respond. Because apology doesn't always mean access. And forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. The final confirmation that I'd made the right choice came quietly. Dorothy told me that Cynthia had been using my story, twisted and reframed, to recruit new members even after I left. She'd painted me as controlling, emotionally unstable, proof that the system protected Ethan. When the article exposed the truth, that narrative collapsed. People saw the lie, and I saw something else, how close I'd come to being erased. Not dramatically, but slowly. By doubt, by testing, by the expectation that love should hurt to be real. I didn't escape a bad engagement. I escaped a system that would have demanded my silence in exchange for belonging. Now, when people ask me if I regret walking away, if I should have tried harder, I tell them this. If you have to prove your worth to stay, you're already losing yourself. I didn't lose a fiancé. I reclaimed myself. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I tell it because for a long time, I wondered if I was too sensitive, too rigid, too unwilling to compromise. That doubt lingered long after Ethan was gone, like a bruise you keep pressing just to check if it still hurts. It does. But it also taught me something. Love doesn't arrive with tests. It doesn't ask you to tolerate disrespect to prove loyalty. It doesn't shrink you slowly and call it growth. And it doesn't recruit other people to pressure you into silence. Real partnership is quiet in a different way. It's the calm of knowing you're safe to speak, the comfort of being believed the first time, the security of having boundaries that are respected, not challenged, mocked, or measured. Walking away didn't make me strong overnight. Healing didn't happen all at once. Some nights, I still wake up thinking about the woman I almost became, the one who would have stayed quiet at that dinner table, paid the bill, laughed off the insult, and told herself it was love. And then I remember. I stood up. I left. I didn't let fear rewrite my instincts. If you're listening to this and something in your relationship suddenly feels off after a commitment, if your partner starts testing you, reframing your boundaries as flaws, or making you feel like you're constantly failing, pause. That feeling is information. Trust it. Because the most dangerous relationships don't start with cruelty. They start with confusion. And if my story does anything, I hope it gives you permission to choose yourself without waiting for permission from anyone else. Some doors don't close because you failed. They close because you refuse to disappear.